And there we go. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our author event tonight. I'm Dave Lucy of Page 158 Books in Wake Forest, North Carolina. We are thrilled to have you here. We'd really love to invite you to our store, but yeah, that's not going to happen anytime very soon, but maybe some point. A couple of quick housekeeping items. I just want to point out there's a chat panel over on the right side of the screen. You can chat amongst yourselves anytime during that or during the event. And there's a ask a question thing on the bottom of the screen. If you click that, you can enter in a question that at the end of the presentation we'll leave a few minutes so that we can ask the authors any questions that you have. You can also type that in the chat and end your question with a question mark, and it'll prompt you to put it into just a one click, it'll put it right in the ask a question thing. You can look at other people's questions and upvote them too. So if you see the number go up there, you can take a peek at it and see what other people are asking and say, I want to ask that same question, and give it a little bump. So like I said, we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end, but feel free to put the questions in whenever you feel like they come up. And let me just say, we are thrilled to host these three authors. And I want to quote Amir's tweet from earlier this week. He said, "It's significant that for the first time, three authors who grew up in post-revolutionary Iran and know that world firsthand have published novels in English in the same year." And that is pretty significant, and we're thrilled to be a part of it. Introductions in the order of publication. So Poupeh Missaghi is a writer and a translator both into and out of Persian, Asymptote's Iran editor-at-large, and an educator. She holds a PhD in English and creative writing from the University of Denver and an MA in creative writing from Johns Hopkins University. Very popular nowadays, Johns Hopkins. Her nonfiction, fiction, and translations have appeared in numerous journals, and she has several books of translation published in Iran. She is currently a visiting assistant professor at the Department of Writing at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. Her debut novel, Transrelating House 1, was published by Coffee House Press in February. Lovely press. Got to visit them actually a couple of years ago. Wonderful people. And next up, we have Amir Ahmadi Arian. And he has published collections of stories, a nonfiction book, and 2 novels in Persian. He's also translated from English to Persian novels by E.L. Doctorow, Paul Auster. Was it 4321?
No, it was a Book of Illusions.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
4321. That came out when I retired from translation.
Okay. P.D. James and Cormac McCarthy, and I got to talk to you about which Cormac McCarthy ones you did.
No Country for Old Men. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah. He holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Queensland in Australia, and he currently lives in New York, where he's earned an MFA in the NYU Creative Writing Program, teaches literature and creative writing at Cooney City College, and his novel Then the Fish Swallowed Him was published by HarperCollins in March, and he also had a baby right around that same time frame, so
yeah,
we have to be quiet and not wake the baby up.
Yeah.
And last but not least, Ali Araghi is an Iranian writer and translator. He has earned his MA in Ancient Cultures and Languages at the University of Tehran and has translated Samuel Beckett into Persian. Great collections here, guys. After completing his MFA from the University of Notre Dame, he is currently working on his PhD in comparative literature, international writers track at Washington University, and his novel, The Immortals of Tehran, was published by Melville House in April, another great publisher we love. Welcome to all of you. I'm going to get out of your way and come back when you guys are ready for Q&A at the end, and have a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Dave.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to be the first one reading. Just about my novel, it's a hybrid work, so there are different layers to the book, and I have tried to do a few of them so you get a sense of the difference of the styles. Okay, so the first part that I'm going to read is the narrative part, and it follows the protagonist, the she, into the city of Tehran. At a cafe, 4 women sit at a table. They order herbal teas. One woman has brought some homemade halva. I don't know why, but today I had an urge to make halva. I'm not sure which dead it's for. Have some and say a prayer for whomever you wish, or for all the dead you know and don't know. or for our own future dead selves, she says half-jokingly. On the walls, there are black and white pictures of neighborhoods around the city. She ignores the halva and stands to look at the images. They are new, she realizes, manipulated to look old. The two young men and a young woman sitting at the next table keep laughing and texting. On the walls, branches and utility poles and gates and windows and cabs and squares and public art and traffic lights and brick walls and newsstands and fruits and birds and construction sites and motorbikes and meat hanging from hooks in front of a butcher shop and flower girls and policemen and trash cans and boulevards and cul-de-sacs and ATMs and cafes and store signs and a mother and child and students and. On the back wall, on the other side of the staircase they've just come up, is a map of the city, not framed, adhered to the wall with dozens of wads of chewed gum. The map looks blurred and is illegible. She gets as close as she can to the railing. The map is many maps of the city, the norths and souths and easts and wests overlaying one another, the dates in the upper right corner turning into a year in a future that may or may not arrive, or in a past that has disappeared without any trace. The streets and alleys and highways converging into a labyrinth with no entrance or exit in time or space. There are several red pins dotting the map, but the lines and words and numbers are so interwoven that no one can really decode the locations they mark or their purpose. One of the women calls her over. She turns around and heads back to the table. She thinks she will ask the server about the map when they leave. I want to take her hand and bring her back to the map. Tell her it's okay, that she doesn't understand, that she just needs to look closely with patience. I want to speak to her about cities spoken by women. Quote, "The city of changes constructed by memory and destroyed by oblivion is a city of death." End of quote. Magdalena Tully, 2004. Quote, "We are heirs and haunted unknowingly. We are the descendants of a body city." End of quote. Ellen Sixu, 2006. Corpse 15, of the living, of the dead. Corpse 34, families keep their silence. Corpse 33, the blame is always elsewhere. Corpse 1, age 23, gender male. Date shot 25th of Khordad 1388, 15th of June 2009. Place shot Tehran. Date of death 18th of Aban 1390, 9th of November 2011. Place of death Boston. Time of death unknown. Cause of death shrapnel residue in brain tissue. Date of burial 30th of day 1390. 20th of January 2012. Place of burial, Berlin. What is the use of the book when the dead are not coming back to life? What can a book do for the void that has filled the life of the lover, the brother, the sister, the parents, the stranger who saw the blood bursting, who heard the sounds of the execution, who didn't see or hear directly but saw or heard in the virtual world, who didn't see or hear at all but inherited the void, dreamt the nightmare of the void? How can the book translate the narrative of death into a narrative of life? How can it use the language of life to translate the experience of death? What is its use if it tells the stories of these deaths in a language other than theirs, in a context other than theirs? What is the use of any of this while the bodies continue to decompose in plots that in 30 years might be shared with other newer corpses? How can we as translators of these events and their narratives find the proper language to voice them? What might the proper language be? Is there just one? Who decides what it is? Reality, media, politicians, family, friends, restrictions, love, memory? How can we translate them into the closed frame of a book, of an art form, of a report, of a memorial, while celebrating the life in them? How can we accommodate a reading that constantly reopens itself, rereads itself, retranslates itself based on our distance from the event, physical and emotional, spatial and temporal, based on our relationship with the event, with the world around it, with ourselves? How can we, within the frame of a book, keep these bodies and their voices alive, audible, relatable? Do the wounds of their bodies and ours heal within the frame of a book that promises to hold on to the scars? Does our healing result from the conversation coming to an end or continuing on? How can we, within the frame of a book, anticipate and allow for all our future wounds, for the wounds of the future readers who will touch the book and be touched by it? How can the book remain a book of journey, not destination? So I'm going to end there. And I guess Amir and Ali are going to join me for conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Amir, do you want to start?
You go ahead.
Okay. So this is not a question specifically for you, Poupeh, but perhaps for all of us we could touch upon later on too. But I was thinking of translation and how it's very central to your book. It's almost on the cover and in the title also. So I was wondering if you care about talking about like your thoughts about translation. You're translator yourself, and I think all of us are in the kind of traditional definition of the word, meaning like taking one text in one language and just rendering it into another language. But does translation? It seems like this is not only about a kind of lingual translation in your case. So I was wondering if you care about talking about translation in your book.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not as you said, like literal translation is not happening, but I think just writing about another place in a different language is inherently doing some form of translation. So both linguistic and cultural. Also, like thinking in terms of how part of the documentation is me looking at like journalism work, visual videos, audio, and then translating them into other forms of language like text. So that's another like form of translation happening. And then like personally also like thinking about like having experienced this myself in like a bodily experience and then translating it into like textual language. Again, like for me feels like another layer of translation. Yeah. And also like even the style, like it is inspired by works of literature in different languages translated into English, which I have read. So in a way, like translation also plays a role in that sense.
Yeah, I kind of noticed like some of that intermedial translations that you were talking about. Like, I was like, oh, this must have been a video or a photo or something that is getting translated into text. So it's interesting that like it happens in multiple layers.
Yes.
Yeah, what I was thinking about when I was reading your book was the question of memory and remembering. You touch on it a lot in your book in different segments of it. But that it's more like a comment. I don't know if you I'm going to talk about it later. But what struck me was that how the memory of the book itself, right? So when you read a book, the book kind of constructs a memory as you read along, right? So by the time you get to the like page 100, then there's like an accumulation of different memories from previous pages. But in your book, that kind of doesn't happen in that sense. This is a book that kind of evades itself all the time, right? It kind of escapes the process of the construction of memory. And in that sense, it to me, it sort of mirrors Tehran as a city, right? And that's because Tehran is exactly that kind of creature that is constantly escaping its own memory and is transforming very radically all the time. It's a city that if you don't visit a neighborhood for like a year, you might get lost in it if you go back to it. Even, it's a place that you lived in. And so, yeah, if you, I don't know if you like paid attention to that, or, what are your thoughts on like memory and memory in the city and memory in Tehran in particular, or the memory of Tehran and the memory of your book?
Yeah. Oh.
What happened?
We may have lost. Oh, I think she's back.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm losing you guys. Like
Yeah,
you both are
you're
frozen.
You're
I
back.
don't know if
You're
you can
fine.
hear me or not.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, like memory was an important.
Now
No.
you're gone.
Yeah.
Okay. So until she gets back, let me just like hop on what you said about like memory and Tehran, like losing stuff, losing your memory. My own childhood neighborhood is now like totally gone. So there's this big highway that
Yeah, where is it?
The Muallim Street.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So it's like now this giant highway that they bulldozed all the houses, all the stores. So yeah.
Actually, I lived there on Sarbaz Street for like 4 or 5 years, right? So it literally went through my house, like my apartment, that highway, Sayyad Highway. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but it's also interesting how like some of the like those actual streets and cafes and shops that we see a lot in Poupeh's book is like some of the things that I actually miss in Iran. There are days when I just want to go back and walk in those streets and sit in such and such cafe. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Okay, you're back.
Yay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I heard part of what you were saying, Eddie, like this memory. I think like that's true. Like the fact that like we go back and after a year, there so many things have changed. But I also think like weirdly, like and paradoxically, there are some things that you feel never change. Like there is like sense of familiarity. But that feeling of like you not being able to hold on to any memory, like with my book, I think like that was part of the intention of like making the reading experience constantly like rebooting itself. So you have to constantly participate with what is happening rather than like being able to put something aside as a memory already shaped. So in a way, it's like as you move forward, you have to rebuild whatever has happened before that. Yeah.
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 So I was also thinking of like the word the documentation that you talked about. Again, this is a question that maybe all of us could talk about later on. But do you want to talk a little bit about how you put these things together? You culled all of these from different sources. What your process was like? Do you think you want to talk about that kind of research?
Yeah, I can. So for the readers' sake, what Ali is referring to, like I just read like the opening lines of, for example, Corpse 1, but in the book you actually see all the details from that person's final moments, how.
Okay.
I think we lost you.
Maybe I should start. Then in Q&A we can.
You're back.
Oh.
You're back.
You're back. We have always been here. Yeah.
Oh, I was.
Yes.
Yeah, you were gone again. Yeah.
Oh, I don't know what's going on.
So you want maybe I can start, while you're fixing
Yes.
that, then we can kind of go back to Q&A later.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. Sorry I can't see you. Yeah, it's a little weird to kind of talk into a void like this. So this novel is about a bus driver in Tehran, and the story is set in 2004, 2005, and it kind of revolves around the story of bus drivers union, which staged a huge strike at the time in the city. And this is a guy who's basically a complete nobody, who's done nothing interesting in his life. Been just driving a bus for the most part, and he gets sort of swept up into this political zeal, and ends up joining the strike, and as a result of that, gets arrested and taken to Evin prison in Tehran, and gets sort of interrogated and spends some time in solitary confinement. So what I'm going to read is from the middle of the book somewhere. One of the chapters that this character, his name is Yunus, is in the solitary confinement, and is alone there, obviously, and he kind of runs into a fly. It's on page 107 for those of you who have the book. Then I saw a fly. The insect, fresh from the free world, was sitting on a slat in front of the open window, rubbing its feelers together. It seemed to be deciding whether to come inside or turn around and fly back out. Its body made a dot on the narrow strip of light between the window slats. The position of its black shadow created the illusion that the edges of the slats bent in towards themselves and made the fly look bigger than it really was. It eventually made up its mind and launched itself into the cell. It maneuvered around briefly, took note of the walls and the ceiling, and alighted back on the slat. "Please stay a little longer." The words left my mouth before I had even thought of uttering them. The fly stopped rubbing its legs like it was weighing my offer. Then it tiptoed on the side of the slat and stood in profile to me. I came to my knees and followed its moves closely. The fly flew into the room again. It floated straight toward me, circled above my head, drifted away, spiraled down, looped back around, and hovered near my face. I closed my eyes and listened with pleasure to its delicate, ear-stroking buzz. Then the fly approached the window, but pulled back quickly. It made another turn around the cell and paused over the toilet bowl, carved out short circles in the air, lowered altitude as meticulously as a helicopter carrying wounded soldiers, and landed on the vomit smear. It jabbed its proboscis into the dry vomit and began to feast. When it had eaten its fill, the fly tore its body off the toilet and took another pass around the cell. It approached the slats 3 times, pulled away at the last second, and returned to hover over my head. It then sped up and zigzagged, swooped down, and landed on my arm. Goosebumps rose up on my skin under its feet. It tiptoed around, up to my elbow and back to the middle of my arm, and paused there. I watched it with admiration. It seemed like a perfect machine. Even the coloring was beautiful, with its gradual change from black to gray. Its body was tiny and frail, and about a quarter of it supported the disproportionately large compound eyes that captured the world in 1,000 simultaneous discrete images. Its feelers settled on my skin and rubbed one another at a carefully calculated frequency, gathering data, or perhaps just enjoying the company of the only other living organism in the cell. "How do you fly?" I asked the insect. "You feed and shit and vomit. You can go wherever you want. How?" The legs of the fly stopped moving along my arm. It must have sensed the threat. How the fuck is that fair? The fly took off and flitted around anxiously near the ceiling. Look, I'm sorry, I said to the insect. My voice grew shrill. I didn't mean it. I just want to get out of here. The fly ignored me and continued tracing warp circles in the air. Then it accelerated suddenly, yanked around, and started flying into the walls. It was suddenly desperate to escape, but couldn't find the way out. It lurched right before correcting its trajectory toward the mesh of the window screen. In a second, it would find it. I jumped up and moved as fast as I could to block the egress. The fly collided with my chest and dove back into the cell, then flew around hysterically. The sudden jump had hurt my knee. I needed to sit and stretch my legs, but couldn't take the risk. Sorry. That was an innocent cough. I don't have any virus or anything. I glared at the fly, offended by its escape attempt. It had fed off my vomit and walked up and down my arm. I could have killed it, and the fly knew it well because it lived in the world of human beings, but I hadn't. It now wanted to go just because I had asked the question. The fly continued on its quest. It checked every inch of the cell for another crack or hole that could offer freedom. The more it tried to escape, the more agitated I got. When the insect had determined there was no other passage to the outside world, it settled on the wall. Listen, I said, I meant no harm. I just want you to stay a little while and keep me company. It's very lonely here. The fly took off again, spiraling and plunging, making abrupt turns and jags. The pain intensified in my knee. It radiated out from my kneecap, spread and circled around the joint. My body implored me to sit and stretch my legs, but I couldn't give the fly a chance to escape. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. It's gonna just go on for a little while. Yeah.
Do you think I should read next? So if someone gets disconnected, the other two have stuff to talk about.
Well, I think we're good now.
Okay. All right.
Maintain the format.
Okay.
I think, like, going back to the question that Ali asked me, I was wondering also about your process of research and how you went back and how you also, like, found the details, or even, like, not just like factual information, but also like how to emotionally document such an experience.
Yeah, well, basically my main motivation for writing this book was the experience of solitary confinement, because I had read quite a lot of prison novels, written everywhere in the world. In the U.S. there's a lot of them. In Iran there's a bunch, but though we have more like memoirs than novels. In Egypt, it's basically a genre. They had a past quite similar to us, and a lot of their writers experienced prison, and so when they got out, they wrote about it. But what caught my attention was that in almost none of those books you had no extensive account of time in solitary, right? Almost all of them began, they kind of throw the guy into jail. Then, they're like brief passages about just being alone in a cell for a while, then going out to, what we call bande umumi, or whatever in different languages it's called. And so when I noticed that, I decided to work on it. And the research process was obviously more, a lot of it was reading those texts. But when it turned out that there is actually not much to find in those documents in terms of solitary confinement, I started talking to people, So for us who lived in Iran, and, maybe I was a little more involved in politics than usual. So it's very common, unfortunately, to have friends, to be surrounded by people who have spent time in solitary, right? It's very, very common. As soon as I thought about doing that, I could immediately think of like a dozen people, some of them my very close friends who have had that experience. So I just started talking to them, and during that research process, I realized why actually we don't have a lot of accounts. It turns out that it's very hard to talk about it. In those interviews that I had with those folks, they had two parts. One of them was about the interrogation room. One of them was about the other one about solitary confinement. They talked very easily about the interrogation room. They kind of happily talked about the interrogator. They a lot of like mimicked their accents, or they made jokes and had like a ton of memories from the interrogation room. But none of them had an easy time talking about solitary. So yeah, I talked to more than a dozen people about that, and so gleaned some information. And actually what you read in the book, in solitary chapters, not a lot of it is my imagination. It's pretty well documented what happens there. So yeah, the research process was maybe 70% of what ended up being included in the book came from interviews.
Are you done?
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that this was something kind of based on something that the strikes were something that happened actually, and big chunks of like what you said was actually happened to other people. So my question, I was thinking about how much you think of your work as being historical, and if you kind of categorize it at all under the kind of historical fiction category. So my other question maybe is that, how do you kind of reconcile between real fact and fiction? Because I think we all know that what happens in reality doesn't necessarily work in fiction. There are a lot of times when you're looking fiction classes, you read someone's work, and then later on the class feels like it's not working, but later on they come out of the writer comes out and says that this was actually something that happened. But like just writing reality as fiction, it's not going to work exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we work between this fictional world and the real / historical thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you wanna, if I have to like ascribe a genre to this, it's a political novel. And I wouldn't call it historical. I think it's just too close to our time to like to take that label. It's 15 years old basically, right? So yeah, it's a political novel, and to answer your question about did it have another part? The first part of your question? So
yeah, I mean the first part was like if you consider it at all historical, and the other is how do you reconcile between reality and fiction? How do you
reality. The fact about reality is just like 99% of it is just too boring to get involved in, to bring into fiction, right? So you basically have to throw away most of it. What I did was I took my cues from reality, from like real documents, right? So I took inspiration, if you like, from them. And so I don't know, say like somebody told me to kind of relate it to the passage that I read. Somebody maybe in passing even told me that once he was sitting in a cell and he saw an ant sort of, running around the cell and, hiding in a little hole in the wall. And he felt like jealous of that ant, right? Thinking that, that creature, the little creature can just get out of the cell at will, and I'm stuck here, right? And so he told me that in passing. He didn't even stay on with it. But so that became my cue or inspiration, right? So then I wrote a whole chapter. It's completely fictional, right? But it has some kind of a root in reality or in somebody's memory. About, it's like a long chapter about just somebody struggling with a fly, this character struggling with a fly in his cell, right? So yeah, that was basically the process. If you trace back all the scenes and moments of this novel, you will find their feet sort of somber on like a real ground. They're all rooted in some kind of real experience, and they're all they all kind of can come from one kind of document or the other, but none of it is actually real. Like I can't really present it as fact, any of it. Yeah.
That's
Shall we just leave to Ali reading?
Sure.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No,
I just want to make sure that you have time to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. That's my beef with realism. The fact that a lot of people aren't conscious that it's realistic writing is not necessarily very real, very close to reality. So there's a lot of distortion of the real that you need to make something realistic. So it's a genre of its own. Oh,
yeah. So your book is the evidence of your beef with realism.
Yes. Speaking of which, so the Immortals of Tehran is a magic realistic family saga. There's a family in the novel that is apparently under some very old curse. The way the curse works is that every other son in the family dies young, and the other lives as if forever. And we follow the life of one of these sons. His name's Ahmad, from when he's very young to when he becomes interested in poetry and becomes actually a very famous poet in the country, and then later on becomes the youngest member of the parliament to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So we start with World War II, and the novel climaxes at the revolution, and then quickly move a few years after that. He writes such good poetry. Something terrible happens at the beginning of the novel, and he loses his voice. So for almost the whole novel, he doesn't speak at all. But he succeeds to write such good poetry that his poems actually literally give off light, and later on set fire on the paper, and that poetry becomes important during the revolution too. The novel also implies that whatever happened in contemporary Iranian history was the doing of cats, not people. So yeah, there's that subplot of cats too. But it's not a novel only about this person. The cast of characters is pretty large. We learn about, we have Khan, Ahmad's grandfather. There's Aga, Ahmad's great-great-great-great-grandfather. And there's a big cast of characters. There are Ahmad's mother, Ahmad's wife, two daughters. Yeah, so I'm going to read a section from the novel that kind of goes back and forth between these characters, and shows how the novel tries to navigate this large cast. In this, what you need to know is that so the characters you're going to hear about in this excerpt is Ahmad, the main character, his wife Homa. They are their first daughter Layla. We hear about Salman. He is Ahmad's childhood friend. He's now a fugitive from the law. We have Puran, Ahmad's mother. Khan, Ahmad's grandfather. Majid, Ahmad's nephew, and Majid's sister, Parveen. Okay, here we go. This is chapter 18, towards the middle of the novel. Homa gave birth to a girl. They called her Layla. She was a perfect mix of Homa and Ahmad and worked miracles. With her first cry, she expelled the silence from the two cursed rooms. Colonel Deldar ironed his uniform, polished his shoes, and welcomed his granddaughter while standing at attention with a stern face but welled-up eyes. When he saw the newborn, Homa's great uncle abandoned his idea that a man had to earn what he possessed and gave Ahmad and Homa the present of a small house. Before the baby was a month old, Homa had rejected the landlady's offer for a decreased rent 5 times. When the moving day came, she had to talk her away from the promise of weekly visits. "What about no rent?" the old woman whispered in Homa's ear as they hugged. The new house was not grand, but it was located in a calm neighborhood. The front door opened into a short corridor that led to a large living room. The kitchen could house a 6-seat dining table and still leave Homa enough room to freely walk from the cabinet to the sink to the stove. The windows in the larger bedroom opened to a small but cozy yard. Homa bought all new pots and pans for the kitchen. She did not protest when her mother made the final decisions about where the furniture would go, or when she shook her head and decreed that the curtains Puran had sewed for the new house would not go with the armchairs in the living room. With the baby so little and fragile, Homa could not bring herself to lose the little of her mother's affection and interest that she had won after the birth of Layla. Puran was offended, but Puran was offended when she saw the orange curtain draping over the windows, but said nothing. The new house, the baby, and the constant visits from both her family and Ahmad's brought a healthy rose to Homa's cheeks within 2 months. Even the baby seemed to like the new house. Lying on her back in her bed, she gurgled and smiled at everyone. One late night, at a time when visitors were not expected, the sound of a stifled knock wound through the house. Ahmad opened the door to Salman, who slipped in silently and gently closed the latch bolt behind him. He had a present in his hands. Homa opened the box and took out a pair of small red girl shoes. The 3 of them sat with a tacit agreement not to discuss the fugitive in the living room, but the friend who slapped his thigh and laughed when Homa told him how when Ahmad had his fedora on, Layla would cry in his arms, not recognizing him as her father, but broke into a hesitant smile when Ahmad took the hat off, only to pout again when the hat was back on. Homa brought fruit in a basket and put on the kettle to make tea. 10 minutes later, before the tea was quite ready yet, a short, high-pitched whistle sounded in the street. Salman sprang to his feet. "Goodbye, Ladybug," he said to the sleeping baby in her room. "Grow up soon." With a confident calm in his movements, Salman rose from the crib, hugged Ahmad, congratulated Homa again, and climbed the stairs up to the roof of the house. That was the first time Ahmad and Homa had Salman in their home, and the last time anyone called Layla Ladybug. Khan was enamored with the baby. Even when no one was busy, he volunteered to look after her. He had a room built specifically for her on the roof. The baby and whoever looked after her would rest in those quarters, and when she grew up, she always had her own private shelter, no matter what. Parveen was so excited to have a cousin that when they told her she was too small to let the baby sleep on her legs, she offered to wash her dirty diapers. Parveen would climb up an empty tin bin to reach the clothesline. After she was done, and when no one was in sight, her brother Majid took the pins off and left the wet diapers to the mercy of the breeze. Later, Parveen picked the white pieces of cloth from the ground and branches of the trees, shook them, then washed them again. Do you want to play Count the Kitties?" Majid asked Khan, patting baby Layla on the back while rocking her in the garden. The old man tousled the boy's hair and sent him away. "Some other time, maybe. Have you done your homework?" Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Merci, Ali.
Shoot.
So so sorry, go ahead.
No, go
Want to
ahead.
say something? Yeah. I have two questions about this. I thought that was a pretty courageous and risky move to, incorporate two different plateaus of reality into one book, right? So you've got like fantasy and things that have sort of that can be imagined as real objects, right? They are on the same plane of like narrative reality as things that are sort of illusions or don't exist, right? And so yeah, this kind of moving back and forth between these two levels, I found it very kind of tricky. That's something I don't dare to do, to be honest. I was thinking to maybe you can kind of learn from you. What was your sort of strategy, narrative strategy to maintain the structure throughout the book, which is a pretty long book, and it's very hard to kind of maintain it all the way through. And what did you do to maintain that balance? And then another thing that occurred to me while I was reading that book was that it's a book that is kind of in conversation with other novels more than anything. I saw just so many references. I don't know if it was just intentional or it was like your reading sort of seeping out onto the page, but just this succession of generations, and like the tone of the book reminded me of 100 Years of Solitude. The kind of cat subplots reminded me of Kafka on the Shore, and it goes so on and so forth. So, and some writers kind of intentionally do that, right? They write a book that is in conversation with other books more than anything. It's it kind of goes back and has like this intertextual relationship with preceding novels. Did you have that in mind too, or it just happened?
So I think about to go to your first question. I think that was the kind of premise of this novel, the way the magical realism, magical realistic elements or magical realism characteristics of this book was supposed to work, was actually kind of bringing the quote unquote magical or fantastic or unreal, extra, like whatever term we want to use here, to the same kind of mundane reality of the rest of the novel. I think so that, to me, that's actually kind of the definition of magic realism. So the way that there is this, I'm trying not to spoil the novel. So the fact that this the fire that comes out of poetry, the fact of the way that poetry becomes like so good that, if you think of like metaphorically, what is good writing, at least in my head, it's like full of energy for fire, warmth, So that, I think the novel, the kind of fictional world that I was hoping to create, allowed this kind of maybe metaphor to become a reality, and then it again allowed me to work with that literal fire to do something else with it in the novels, and also because I wanted to play with the idea of cats behind things in Iran. I needed this kind of logic in this fictional universe. I wanted a universe that allowed these cats to make sense in the revolution. And as for the 100 Years of Solitude and Kafka, actually both are novels that I think I didn't finish either of them. Well, but they were, I think, very influential, especially 100 Years of Solitude, in terms of just the voice. Like there were times when like I couldn't get into writing. There were days when I couldn't get into writing, but they'll just read a few sentences, even just one sentence of Marquez, and it would just get the voice, the feeling, the energy of the kind of narrator that he uses. And I wasn't trying to be exactly in conversation with those novels. One reason being I did not finish them, embarrassingly. But yeah, they were inspirations.
Mm.
I have a question as well, Ali. I'm very much interested, like, in the pacing of the novel, like how you keep the rhythm, and like how did you make the decisions of like where to expand and then where suddenly to just like cut and go into like another time frame or like another incident? Like, did you, for example, write a much longer thing and then cut, or did you write a shorter thing and then like decided to expand parts? So yeah.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to cut anything I read. So no, it wasn't a much longer thing. It was a little bit longer, but not much longer. So I needed, like I said, the novel spans about 70 years in Iranian history, from World War II to around 2008, 9. And it's not very long, but it's kind of it's not short either. So I was when I wrote it, I knew that it was going to be something upwards of 350 pages. So I needed a strategy. I needed a narrator that gave itself leeway to move freely back and forth in time, and also up and down to look at the history in general, the big picture, and zoom in on each and every character, getting to the headspace of characters. And also because I had a large cast of characters, and it was one part of the project was to show that all of these characters are able to have their own novels. It's not a novel about just one hero, one character, one protagonist. Of course, we have Ahmad as kind of protagonist. I couldn't write something with like no one as the main protagonist, but I wanted to kind of imply that all of these characters' lives and lines are very interesting, and we could spend a long time with them. So I needed to spend enough time with each character to make them well-rounded and believable. So yeah, I had to do this thing, just zoom in, zoom back out, and jump ahead of time, sometimes go back. And that's what makes the pacing of the novel. In general, I think it gets a little bit faster as you pass the halfway or two-thirds mark. Because again, it's kind of longish, so I didn't. It was a challenge not to be boring and to make everybody as well-rounded as possible. Thank you. Do you think we should conjure Dave?
Good. I'm here. How are y'all? Great job. Yeah, we got a couple of questions here. So it would be nice to hear from the authors about the experience of writing in their second language and how this experience has shaped their work.
Who wants to go first?
You go. We go. Repeat the order. Yeah.
For me, actually, writing in a second language was very much liberating because I didn't expect very much of myself. So I allowed myself to be playful, to do whatever I wanted. And also, like, it felt to me like a learning process. Like, while I was writing it, I was also learning how to do things with language. So in that sense, it was very playful for me. It gave me liberties that I would not be able to give myself in Persian. Also, I think like I'm intimidated by like the fact that like in Persian, like it being my native language, I felt like I need to have like a certain level of standard or meet some expectations of myself to be able to do that. And I didn't feel I had that.
Like from a literary perspective?
Both literary and even linguistically. And yeah, but with English, as I said, like I didn't have any like yardstick for myself. I was like, whatever I do is good, and I would just like play and see what works and what doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it was just very different. I didn't expect it to be this different from, because I wrote novels in Persian too, so I had something to kind of compare this experience to. And yeah, I was surprised how it was as if someone else was writing this book, right? It was a self that I couldn't recognize, or my former self couldn't recognize. And so, yeah, I realized that writing in a second language is not like you writing in a second language. It's another universe. You almost carve out a new universe in your head. And from that universe, then, you know, this new thing is kind of being sort of begotten. And yeah, it was liberating as well, as Poupeh said, you know, because you have an insurmountable gap. There's an insurmountable gap between you and your second language. I think Nabokov said that you know, no matter how well you learn a language, there's 10% that always remains out of your reach, and that 10% is always about nastiness. And so I'm kind of glad to miss that part. But yeah, because you have that gap always, you know, it's impossible to fill it. That gap it can be frustrating sometimes, but it's liberating too, because, you know, the language doesn't sort of, it's not sticky, you know, it's not like clinging to your soul all the time, right? You can kind of sometimes move away and look at it from a distance and do things with it that you wouldn't do in your native tongue. So yeah, but the new self that I discovered in writing in English was probably the most interesting part, right? This whole new character I almost created out of myself by writing this book, and other things in English.
It's fascinating.
For me, it was a little bit, I think, more organic, the transition. I studied English from, I started going to English school from when I was 12, and later on when I was at college, I taught English to little kids. And then I started translating. I founded this literary journal that was dedicated to translating Persian fiction into English. So I started translating from Persian into English a little bit before I moved to Notre Dame to do my MFA. And then once there, I started writing English, and a year or two after, when I began writing this novel, writing in Persian was not the default for me because of the MFA and the workload at school. So I started this in English, and it formed in English. It got formed in English, whereas in a way that sometime later, like a year or two later, I thought I could. I had a great idea of maybe to write the next draft in Farsi so as to be faster and just think about the story and then translating back into English. I couldn't do it. Then I realized that it had been like the novel had formed in English. So it was a rather an organic kind of shift, but it was a totally different thing also. But in another way, the way that I need to go to the dictionary all the time, go to the thesaurus all the time to check different like synonyms and check and double check the definitions of words and expressions and idioms and stuff. It kind of, I think, allows me to write a little bit better prose that I mean, it's like the obsession with the language. I think it's helped me to form better sentences, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that point that you mentioned, Ali, like that practice and learning the language like from an early age, I think that was also part of why I started like writing creatively in English as well. Like I never practiced writing in Persian like I practiced English. Like I wrote reviews and summaries of books and all of that stuff and essays in English rather than in Persian. So it felt like more natural, but at the same time distant, allowing for that creativity. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Let's see. So Rachel wanted to know, how do you keep your novels from being forced into categories that might not invite interest from a broad audience? For example, someone who thinks your books are specifically only to people who are interested in Iran or Egypt or prison, or I find that many of my friends and family see themes like that and think they won't connect to the material, and I luckily find the opposite. And I can testify that Rachel is one of our great customers, and she is a fantastic reader, and she does read a wide swath of stuff. And actually, we had a couple of customers that early on we had included Ali's book in. We were doing grab bags, if you will, that are kind of just a creative way to deal with the pandemic and being basically closed. Is just sort of like, give us a budget, tell us what kind of books you like, and we're going to send you some books. And we had your book in because I had dinner with you and I knew how great the book was, and we included it in a couple of the grab bags, and the feedback we got from it was tremendous. These were people who were like, this is not a book that I think if had I walked into the bookstore I necessarily would have picked up, but it was fantastic. It was so good, and I'm anxious to do the same thing with Poupeh and Amir's books, because I mean it's the same thing. It's exactly what Rachel's talking about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think like for my book specifically, because it's hybrid and it brings in like criticism, it brings in literary theory, it brings in like questions, critical thinking around. So it's, even though like the core of the story happens in Iran, there's a larger context and conversation about how these issues that are happening in Iran are also global, timeless issues that many people around the world are thinking about. So I think like for me, like the hybridity is a way to be in conversation with a larger audience. Not necessarily that was my intention, but I think that's like one of the impacts of that choice.
Right.
Yeah, I kind of try not to think about that, to be honest. I think it's just totally out of my control. And if you set out to write, something that satisfies this or that audience, any audience, right? That the people are interested in Iran or in prison or in politics or whatever, right? If you do that, I think it's a recipe for failure. You really need to do your thing, like tell a story, tell your own story, tell a story that you can tell. Right. And then, you just kind of send it out there and say, it's like raising a child, right? You can do only so much when they're, after a certain age, they just go out and, end up being something you've never imagined. And so, yeah, that's sort of my approach to this question. I understand this concern and I have it too, right? How to avoid pigeonholing my book, or how to kind of write something that the industry cannot pigeonhole. But I think that's just it's a lost battle without even you start fighting it. So yeah, I try to kind of get it out of my head.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was consciously trying not to write something that would be read as a window into Iran, into Iranian life. So I had no intention. I think I consciously refused to teach, what quote unquote teach my reader about Iran, and that kind of dovetails with the way the fictional world of the novel is built, in the sense that although it is historical, although you can categorize it as historical fiction, but it doesn't adhere as closely to the maybe traditional standards of historical fiction. But rather than that, there is a kind of mythological logic that the novel is kind of following, in the sense that it kind of tries to push history and politics to the background as far as much as possible. I'm going to concentrate on the lives of people as a kind of collective of characters that make that history by living it, as opposed to, so that's why, like, for example, you don't see a lot of like dates or a lot of historical names. There are a few, but not a lot.
Yeah.
So that's one way that this novel is trying to navigate that.
Cool. All right. So got another one from Rachel. She was asking specifically about Immortals of Tehran and moving between that realism and fantasy, and I think you kind of talked about that a little bit, but you did a great job of blurring those lines, between the two, and it's very. I was thinking it reminded me of. Have you ever read Master and Margarita?
Unfortunately, not.
By Bulgakov. It's a really, really good book, but it has those elements of that like kind of realism with the fantasy kind of intertwined in a way that I'm not personally somebody who would typically read fantasy. That's not the books that sort of really speak to me, but when it's well done, you had said to me when we had dinner that like tell the little inspiration story that you were.
Oh yeah, okay. So the novel started when I was back Iran. I was walking on a sidewalk and I saw this cat walking towards me on the sidewalk. For those of the viewers who don't know, street cats are pretty common in Iran, so you see them everywhere. But they're usually wary of people if they eye you up. If you do something crazy, not even crazy, if you just walk towards them, they may run away. But this one was just like walking toward me and not even looking at me, eyeing me up. And it was at that moment when I felt like the cat was assuming the same rights of citizenship, the same rights to the path as me. And I was like, oh, so what if these cats are not just wandering around? What if they're doing something, they're plotting something? And then the idea snowballed into this novel. I want to give you time to finish your thought, Dave, and then I can maybe continue for real quick.
Yeah. So just so that story, when you told that to me, that like I wasn't even thinking about the fantastical aspects of that would be included. You know what I'm saying? Like that didn't really. That was just a great. I couldn't wait to read it because I was like, what if they were? That's a great question to ask. So I think to Rachel's question about, how do you blur those lines? I mean, is it just?
So again, that was part of the project and a very hard decision for me to make. How to establish that reality of this world that is not necessarily known to many of my potential readers, and then introduce these magical, fantastical elements. So I remember, like at some point, I was thinking of how involved should the cats be, and I was asking myself, should the cats talk? I was like, no talking. So, my point is that line between the real and the fantastic was actually something that I spent a good time trying to fine tune. I don't know how I did.
Yep. No, you did fantastic. You did a great job. I would like to ask if Amir and Poupeh, if you could just touch on the catalyst for your stories, if you had one that was a particular event or something that you saw.
So mine started as 3 different projects. I wrote the part about Tehran because I missed being in the city and walking around and being in the streets or with people. The part with the documentation started because I wanted to learn more about the 2009 events, even though I had been there, even though I had read everything while it was happening. I still felt this huge gap inside myself, and I wanted to constantly revisit the time. So that was the intention with that layer. And then the layer that I didn't read from was the World of Dreams, which came from a dream journal that I was keeping while I was working on the book. And at some point I decided that the World of Dreams also is part of our history, and I wanted that to be in conversation with the other 2 layers. And the I part, which is like the meta fiction, the author literary criticism part and the questions, that came kind of late into the project because I had all these ethical concerns with the work that I was doing. I was asking myself a lot of questions about this work. And at some point I realized like I need to have them in the book as part of the story. Otherwise something would be missing, something would not be working right for me.
I like the questions being in there. Like that's a great.
I agree. Yeah, it wouldn't be a complete book without them.
Right. And Amir?
Yeah, for me it was just as I touched on before, I was in Tehran when that strike happened. That's actually based on a kind of a real event, and I happened to live not far from the bus terminal where the novel opens. Right. Nothing happened there, right? That violent scene didn't take place there. But what I noticed was that, when the bus drivers union went on strike, they just shut down the whole city, at least the western part of the city where I used to live. And at the time, the subway was not that common in Tehran, and like the burden of city traffic was shouldered by the buses. Sure. And without them, it was almost apocalyptic for a few days, right? You couldn't really move. There was a swarm of people everywhere. Everything was in chaos, and you couldn't really get anywhere. And what impressed me a lot at the time was how a workers' union could exercise power, right? Could defy the sort of the city authorities and government by on like a higher level, and shutting down like a city and part of the city that had never happened before, at least not after the revolution. And there was this show of power, this like demonstration of will and power I never expected to see in Iran, and it was really encouraging and just beautiful to watch it, even though it crippled everyday life. But it was very nice to see. And so that experience stayed with me, and I kind of carried it through the years. And in 2016 I started working on this book. And there was another thing, one image that I read somewhere. Somebody told me, I don't know, I could never after the fact, I was never able to trace it back, that I was told that when so in one of the bus terminals, when they went on strike, they brought in sort of strike breakers as drivers. So they brought in their own drivers, so they would drive the buses out of the terminal and go out to the city and pick up people. And so when one of them sits at the wheel, there's like people running into the terminal from outside. A woman lies down in front of the bus, right? And so the bus has to kind of run over her to get out of the terminal, and that way she just stops this whole strategy, to break the strike. And that image was also another inspiration. I had this, I have to write it somewhere. I have to put this somewhere. Maybe I just wrote this book to give like a literary life to that particular image. Yeah, this is the combination of these two inspirations. I think they're behind this book.
Fantastic. Well, we are a little over an hour, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all so much for the time. It was fantastic, really, really fascinating stuff. I would encourage all of you, if you don't have to buy them from us, but buy these books. They're fantastic. You will eye-opening, great stuff. There's a link at the bottom of the screen that says buy the books. That will take you right to our website where you can buy the books. We have them in stock right now. Ship them out right away. And we're also going to be getting some signed book plates from these three. So I will get those out into the mail to you all, and then you can sign them and send them back to us. And if you like to draw pictures, there's a little bit of room there. You can draw a picture on there if you like to. So, but we really appreciate the time. And yeah, thank you all very much. Thanks everybody for coming. And we hope to see you at the next one. And hopefully we'll see you all in person someday.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave, for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Dave. Thanks to everyone for joining. This was a great event to be in conversation with you, Ali, Amir, both of you.
Yeah, so likewise.
Yeah, I think you guys have a future in the
yeah. Also good to see you virtually, at least.
Right. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Take care.